science class, we'll be looking at some of the main features of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979, Part 4. Separation of power. The legislative and the executive were completely separated in both function and personnel. So one of the main features of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979 is there was complete separation of power amongst the executive and the legislative arms of government in terms of both their functions and the people in charge of these duties. Legislative powers. The legislative powers were shared between the federal and the 19 state governments in the federation. The federal or central government, through the parliament, could legislate on items on the exclusive legislative list, while both the central and state governments could legislate on items under the concurrent legislative list, while only the regional or the state government could legislate on items under the residual legislative list. So, another feature of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979 is that the legislative powers of the government were shared amongst the federal government and the 19 state governments and the federations. And they were shared in terms of what we call the exclusive legislative list, the concurrent legislative list, and the residual legislative list. The federal or state government, through the parliament, could legislate on items on the exclusive list. So, any item that is included under the exclusive legislative list could only the federal government could legislate on those items. Whatever item was listed under the concurrent legislative list, both the central government and the state government could legislate on such items, while any item that is listed under the residual list, only the state government could legislate on such items. Another characteristic of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979 is federal character. The appointment of qualified personnel into any federal establishment or agency as a minister of the government was to be done to reflect the federal character. What is the federal character to start with? The federal character states that is a principle that states that everybody, every religion, every ethnic group, every difference that we have in Nigeria must be adequately represented in the federal system, in the public service. Every religion, every ethnic group, every language, every tribe must be adequately represented under the federal character. So, one of the main features of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979 is what we call the federal character, which says that the appointment of qualified personnel into federal establishments or agencies as a minister was to be done to reflect the federal character. That is, it must be done to reflect our federal differences, our federal diversity. Every language should be represented well. The tribes, the ethnic groups, and religion should be well represented in the civil service. In other words, appointment should not be segmented to a certain ethnic group, to a certain religion, or to a certain tribe or language, but appointments into the civil service or federal establishments should be spread across the country. Local governments. The Constitution made provision for a democratically elected local government council. It also listed the functions of the council. So, another feature of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979 is the Constitution made provision for a democratically elected local government councils. And it also listed the functions of the councils. Fundamental human rights. The Constitution entrenched a comprehensive provision for the fundamental human rights of the citizens. Such rights included rights to life, rights to dignity of human person, rights to personal liberty. So, another feature of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979 is that it entrenched a comprehensive provision for fundamental human rights of the citizens. And such rights included the right to life. Nobody had the right to take anybody's life unlawfully. Right to dignity of human person and right to personal liberty. So, another feature of the Second Republican Constitution was that there was entrenchment of a comprehensive provision of fundamental human rights of the citizens. Still under the main features of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979, we have the Federal Capital Territory. Provisions were made for the establishment of a new Federal Capital Territory as the seat of the government of the Federation. So there was provision for the seat of the Federal Capital Territory as the seat of the government of the Federation. Appointment of ministers. The president's appointment is ministers, who we can also call the cabinet, from anywhere in the country, but it was subject to the approval of the National Assembly, which is the House of Senate and the House of Representatives together. So the House of Senate and House of Representatives had to approve the person that the president has appointed to be a minister before the person could be approved as a minister. So there was need for the approval of the National Assembly before the president could appoint his ministers. And that is one of the main features of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979. The president could appoint ministers, but the ministers were subject to the approval of the National Assembly. Another feature of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979 is appointment of political advisors. The Constitution empowers the president to appoint his political advisors in other areas. Also, to appoint licensed officers in the 19 states of the Federation. So, the president had the power to appoint political advisors, and the president could appoint his political advisors in any area. Also, he had the power to appoint his licensed officer in the 19 states of the Federation. The next thing is the president was also the commander-in-chief of the country's armed forces. That is, the president had the power to move the army. So the president was the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and he had the power to mobilize, move the army. Election of the president. The president has the whole country as his constituency and was directly elected by the electorate. Who are the electorate? You and I. Every citizen of Nigeria is an electorate and has the right to vote for their choice of the president, put their choice presidential candidates into office. So election of the president was done by the whole country, since the whole country was the constituency, and the president was directly elected by the electorate, who were the whole country. Runoff election. The provision of a runoff election was made in the Constitution. If no winner emerged in the first general election with an overall majority, that is, in a presidential election, if none of the candidates satisfy the provisions of the Constitution, another election would be held. This election was known as a runoff election or second ballot election. However, the runoff election would not involve all the candidates again, but only those that had met the regulation. So, under the Second Republican Constitution of 1979, there was provision for a runoff election. When would a runoff election take place? If no winner emerged in the first general election with an overall majority based on the conditions that be stipulated in the Constitution. For example, a condition that could be stipulated could be the winner of an election must win 50% of the vote and won. So, for example, we are only 300 in a country, in Nigeria. So, whoever will be declared the president of the country must have 151 votes at least before the person is declared the president of the country. So, other countries, this is just one of the conditions that might be stipulated. Other countries could have other ways that they declare their winner. For example, they might divide the votes among the numbers of candidates that are vying for the political office and then add one to it before the person can be declared the winner. So these are just conditions that might be in the Constitution before a person can be declared the winner. So if nobody meets that condition, then a runoff election would be made. And in the runoff election, not all the candidates that initially contested would be involved in the runoff election, but only those that met those certain regulations that are made before the person would. It was only those that have met some certain stipulated conditions or regulations that would be able to go for the runoff election. For example, those that have below, probably, for example, we are 300 in the country, probably those that have below 50 votes in the first election would be cut off, and those that have above 50 votes are those that would be allowed to move forward to the runoff election. So there are different conditions or regulations that might have been put down in the Constitution, but based on the runoff election, that is what happens before a runoff election takes place. Supremacy of the Constitution. The supremacy of the Constitution as the supreme law of the country was enshrined in the Constitution. So like what we had in the Independence Constitution and the 1963 Republican Constitution, whereby there was supremacy of the Parliament as against supremacy of the Constitution. Under the Second Republican Constitution of 1979, there was supremacy of the Constitution, and the Constitution was seen as the supreme law of the country, and it was enshrined in and the supremacy of the Constitution was equally enshrined in the Constitution. Another feature of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979 is the unicameral legislature. The 19 states of the Federation operated a unicameral legislature. So as against what we had under the 1963 Republican Constitution and the 1960 Independence Constitution, when Nigeria was still operating a bicameral legislature at the regional levels, that is, we had the House of Assembly and the House of Chiefs. The provision that was made for the regional legislature under the 1979 Second Republican Constitution is a unicameral legislature. So we're operating a unicameral legislature, which was only the House of Assembly. So the House of Chiefs was abolished. We no longer had House of Chiefs. We only had House of Assembly under the regional legislature, that is at the regional levels. Method of amendment. The method or the process of amending the Constitution was rigid because the Constitution we're using in Nigeria was a rigid Constitution. The 1979 Second Republican Constitution was a rigid Constitution, and it was therefore difficult to amend. But the method and procedure for the amendment of the Constitution was also enshrined in the Constitution, but it was rigid. It was very difficult to amend, and it usually would take a very long time before the Constitution could be amended. Appointment of judges. The Chief Judge, the Chief Justice, Supreme Court, and the High Court judges were appointed by the President with the approval of the National Assembly. So the President was the one that appointed the Chief Judge, he appointed the Supreme Court and the High Court judges, and he also he appointed them on the approval of the National Assembly. So if the National Assembly does not approve a certain person to become a High Court judge, the person could not be appointed by the President. So although the President appointed these people, he had to the National Assembly had to approve them before they were appointed into office, before they were put in office. So appointment of judges is also one of the main features of the Second Republic Constitution of 1979, in that the President was the one that appointed the Chief Justice, the Supreme Court, and the High Court judges, but this was done with the approval of the National Assembly. Citizenship. Provision on how to acquire citizenship was equally enshrined in the Constitution. Provisions on how to acquire citizenship was equally enshrined in the Constitution. So in the Constitution, there was the way you could acquire the ways of the procedure or the methods through which you could become a citizen of Nigeria was equally written in the Constitution. Provision was made on how to acquire citizenship. And with this, we've come to the end of the class. In the course of this class, we looked at the main features of the Second Republican Constitution of 1979. We talked about the fact that now we were electing the president. It was the people, the citizens, the electorate, me, you, and I, that were now electing the president. It was no longer an indirect election by the National Assembly, which consists of the House of Representatives and the House of Senate. We also talked about the fact that a runoff election would be conducted if there was no winner in the first election. We talked about the supremacy of the Constitution as against the supremacy of the Parliament, a unicameral legislation now at the regional levels. The method of amendment of the Constitution was rigid. Appointment of judges was done by the President on the approval of the National Assembly, and we talked about the provisions to acquire citizenship. With this, we've come to the end of this class, and I'll definitely see you at the next class.